It's not up there. Then if we take this region of the stomach that rises above the rest, is known as the fundus. In x-rays, it typically is black because air is usually occupying the area, and air doesn't reflect the radio-opaque component. The narrow region that you see here is identified as the pylorus. Some books refer to a more narrowed segment, that's the pyloric canal, but just pylorus is fine. And we see an even greater thickening of the smooth muscle at that point. That's the end of the stomach, and so we have this sphincter separating stomach and small intestine, and this would be the pyloric sphincter. And then the rest of this in between is known as the body. We have the curvatures that we described when we were talking about the blood supply. So this would be lesser curvature. And greater curvature. Hence lesser omentum and greater omentum. And before we get to the actual GPAT, if you will, here's the stomach and the cadaver. You can see the greater omentum hanging down below, and then the stomach opened up here. So this is the actual cadaver stomach diagrammed over here. You can see these longitudinal folds of mucosa due to the contraction of the muscularis mucosae, and these are known as rugae. So now this is the third time that we've seen the term rugae. We had it in the vagina, the urinary bladder, and now in the stomach. Okay? But in contrast to the small intestine, where we'll see folds, in the small intestine, those are circular folds. So these are longitudinal folds. But still a very similar function, just increasing surface area.
So when they do the gastric bypass surgeries, what part of the stomach do they usually?
Okay, well it depends on whether we're talking gastric bypass or a lap band, which is actually a lot safer. So in a gastric bypass, what they typically do is segment that part off. Okay? What would be the problem with that based on what we've covered already?
There's a whole piece that.
Yeah, but more of the function of the stomach itself. When we lose that much gastric tissue, what are we also losing?
The vein, the arteries.
Intrinsic factor. Okay, so that's produced by the self of the stomach, and we're taking away half or 2/3 of those. So another procedure is the lap band, which is adjustable, and it narrows the diameter. So that's placed around here at this level, and they don't actually segment or cut out part of the stomach. They just tighten it, and you still have to have smaller amounts of food that you ingest that would pass through that. But then you have the surface area, you have all the cells, those haven't been surgically removed. So in light of that, you could always take intrinsic factor by injection or by pill or something like that, but I think it's a little bit safer when you remove all the stomach tissue. Yes. Yeah, I have a guy that used to work in the office at my kid's school had that procedure about 18 months ago, and he was a diabetic and has lost 90 pounds and is no longer diabetic.
I know 2 people that have done it, and they've both lost over 100 pounds.
So he lives alone. His mom died about a year ago, 2 weeks ago, And so he's just taken up juicing. So every day his Facebook post is a picture of some new combination that he's come up with. And he said if he'd done that prior to the surgery, he couldn't have handled all the carbs. It would have sent him into a diabetic coma with all the fruits and vegetables on there. All right, so now let's look at the GPAT. So the general plan of the alimentary tract, that's the mucosa, the mucosa, and let's see the modifications or specializations we're going to see on that. That brings me to these three diagrams over here on this board. And these three diagrams are showing modifications to the mucosal folding. So the next slide here is showing the folding surface epithelium of the stomach. So our muscularis mucosae is going to be, the mucosa is going to be right here. So this is going to be, this doesn't have anything to do with it. Someone's asking me a question about the large intestine. So we have for the stomach, this is our surface, it's rather flat, and we have wide gastric pits and the narrow singular branched gastric glands. Well, if you were to shrink yourself and take a walk along the surface of the stomach landscape, you would see lots of small holes, like snake holes, all right? And then every once in a while, scattered large pits, large wide openings for wells. And that's what those gastric pits are. When we move to the small intestine, the landscape changes, and we don't just have the small snake holes, we have bushes. So the small intestine requires a greater amount of surface area. And Sierra asked me in the morning class if she'd read that it was about the size of a tennis area, tennis court, and I associate that with the lung tissue, but I looked it up in the break. And yet the surface area of the small intestine is about the sum total of 2 tennis courts, or a set of tennis courts. So we increase that surface area, not just with the infolding, but the outfolding of these villi. And then when we look at the colon and rectum, we take the glands that we see in the intestines and the stomach without the pits, without the villi, and we have a very smooth surface that we walk on, and just the infolding of the glands. Okay? So just a basic pattern.
The line underneath the gastric gland
is the muscularis mucosa. So that's the depth of the mucosa. So I'm on page 26 now.
Smile, you're on camera.
May I erase the image I have here? So our mucosa for the stomach now is the first time we actually start the simple columnar epithelia. Remember, those were the two types of epithelia that we see in our digestive tract: non-cornified, stratified squamous, beginning and the end. And in between, we have simple columnar. So the stomach is the first place that we see this simple columnar epithelium. However, we do not have goblet cells. We will have goblet cells in the small intestine and in the large intestine. We have loose irregular connective tissue. There's very little loose irregular connective tissue in the stomach between the glands compared to what we see in the small intestine and large intestine between the glands. So that's a fine point I'm not going to test you on, but looking at the histology, it can sometimes help you figure out whether or not you're looking at gastric glands or at intestinal glands. So let me diagram our gastric pit. And again, this is lined with simple columnar epithelia. Instead of goblet cells, we have mucus-secreting cells forming the surface epithelium and lining the pit. And so these are identified as surface and neck mucus cells. That's what replaces the goblet cells. And that's what you're seeing up here is the pink and the white. This area up here is very, when you look in the histology, is quite prominent. All right, it is also very helpful. I'll show you some histology slides in a moment. It's also helpful in identifying, because sometimes the pits depth vary. In some parts, if you're taking a medical histology course, you would use that to identify whether you were in the fundus or in the pylorus by how deep those pits are. So let me show you an image. So on this diagram, this is actually a drawing of a photograph. This is in the pylorus, and the pits extend a little bit more than halfway through the length of the mucosa. Whereas in the fundus, they're about 25% the length. This is what I'll typically show you. I'm asking you to identify the stomach, the image on the far right. This is so too easily confused with the small intestine. This starts looking like villi of the small intestine. Okay? Even though we have the mucus cells and not goblet cells. In the stomach, we would have the mucus cells. If this was the small intestine, these would be goblet cells. Okay? But it's getting to be kind of a fine point there. The rest of the gastric gland, so this would be the pit, and this would be the gastric gland. The enzymes of the stomach are activated by hydrochloric acid, and so these cells have a kind of a round or triangular appearance, and they're kind of shown their different color there. Because of the acid, they have a pink color to them. They're much more eosinophilic or pink than other cells. And they're easy to pick out. So these would be parietal cells. Hydrochloric acid is not to break down the food, but to activate some of the enzymes that do, that we'll look at next week. And that larger. Okay, then the other cells are going to be releasing some of the digestive enzymes and the intrinsic factor. And these are known as G cells. They're the most common cell down in the gland. So they're going to make enzymes and intrinsic factor. It's these enzymes that are activated by the hydrochloric acid. And down at the very bottom of the cell, let me put my larger image up here, we have cells that make hormones. So they're going to be down near the muscularis mucosa. The stomach is an endocrine organ, as well as an exocrine organ. This would be the duct for the exocrine secretions. And the endocrine secretions would be going, notice the different placement of the nucleus. The nucleus is near the surface, because the basal surface is the secretory surface. So we flip the orientation of those cells. And the primary hormone made is a hormone known as gastrin. So these cells are identified as entero, from digestion, enteroendocrine, or G cells for the gastrin. hormone gastric. Then we would have our muscularis mucosa, because this tissue definitely has a muscularis mucosa. And you can see it here on this slide, right here. And that's the end of our mucosa. All right, the submucosa is standard. Nothing different about it. Just dense, irregular connective tissue with blood vessels and lymphatics. Back to the template. And that's what we're seeing down below here, at least in part. So in this image, there's the muscularis mucosa, here's the submucosa. Okay. Then we pick up another variation, and that's in our muscularis externa. What's the major function of the stomach? Mechanical digestion. We do release enzymes, all right? But the enzymes that are released stop their functioning as soon as they get to the small intestine because of the change in pH. So they don't function for very long. So our major effect is the mechanical churning, the mechanical digestion, not breaking chemical bonds, but getting smaller and smaller components to increase surface area. So we add another layer of muscle to the two layers we described in our basic pattern. So outer longitudinal is going to run the length of the stomach. An inner circular is going to encircle the stomach as its name indicates. And then kind of at 45-degree angle to those, we have an innermost oblique. So that's our modification, is adding that third layer that allows the twisting and churning. Okay? So we have an innermost oblique. An inner circular. And an outer longitudinal. And finally, that brings us to the last layer, a serosa, a regular serosa, okay, also known as a visceral peritoneum. So the description of that is going to be standard. So if you can't see what I'm writing serosa hyphen standard.
So standard for cirrhosis is visceral peritoneum.
Yeah. Premise epithelium, loose irregular connective tissue. All right, so we're done with anatomy of the stomach now. Let's move on to the small intestine. This is where everything happens. Well, not everything, but most everything. May I raise the board? Guys okay with that? Okay, cool.
When we're hungry and our stomach is making a noise, do you know what causes that noise?
The grumbling?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's probably a combination of liquid and air. Organ noises?
Yeah.
That's sorry.
I need a picture.
Oh.
Oh.
What do you think it was? Someone in your stomach talking?
No, you too.
I texted. chicle, chicle.
We have three regions or components to the small intestine. Duodenum means about a foot, all right, not foot as in pedo, but 12 inches. And it's actually around 10 to 11 inches long. It is really a receptacle, okay? It's a receiving area. It is C-shaped, picks up from the pyloric sphincter, and it is also retroperitoneal. So this is the first component of the digestive tract that we've covered, that is retroperitoneal.